the state. Go through. Now, when we look at our math, we can see that our economically disadvantaged. Sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
So a point of info for myself is that with and without exit, these are students who have now moved beyond that into another category.
Yeah, the state changed some things on us. It was a little bit of a surprise this year, actually. But what happened is with the new guidelines with ESSA for federal, what happened is we're not allowed to count our exit students from the ESOL program anymore. So if they're not receiving services, they cannot count in the English learners pass rate. So they removed them. So that's why we put the without in there. So actually, if I go back to the reading one, if I recall, the 40 is I'm trying to like look at the apples piece here, apples to apples. But last year, if it counted, it was actually 69. So, but when you remove our exit students from that grouping, it fell to 40, and then this year was 32. So that's what the without exit means.
Thanks. Great question. So again, and I want to remind you to think back to our aggregate data and where we fell with our state and our local performance, and remembering that in a lot of these areas we were number one or top 5, top 6 in the aggregate, and outperforming a number of the local jurisdictions in all of these areas. But again, in this slide, we see that our economically disadvantaged did make a great jump of 13 points, but they're performing below the state. And our L's also made a jump of 9 points, but commensurate with the state, they're at 52 and the state is at 59. And then we put yellow around the Hispanic because they are right at that state level. And with our writing, we see that our L's are 5 points below the state, and we know that's a small group, but a minimum of at least 30 in that group. So they're able to be counted. One of the things, we didn't highlight anything on this particular slide, but one of the things that really jumped off the page at me is that our black students, when you compare our black students to other students in that category locally and across the state, our black students do pretty well. But one of the questions I might have is, does that achievement gap or performance gap compared to all students, and when we look at the 95, 90, 75, might that be something that may we need to look at or think about culturally responsive instruction and how certain lessons and topics might be introduced or taught, because that's a number that stood out to me, although like I said, we didn't highlight it. Okay, science. Again, our L's made a nice jump, but we're still seeing that they are performing below that state level.
Sorry.
Have you done a regression to determine of these different factors which are more highly contributory? Because presumably, the numbers may not be large enough, but you could have a fairly reasonable analysis to the extent to which, say, economically disadvantaged contributed to a lower SOL score vis-a-vis being an English language learner.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We know that we do have students that cross categories, and so we haven't disaggregated to that level yet. But that's definitely something that I think we would look at. It would be important for us to look at. But absolutely, we know that we may have some students that are economically disadvantaged but are also Hispanic, or some students who may be a special ed student without a 504, but also economically disadvantaged as well.
Just as another sort of data-related point, my recollection is from prior conversations about this, that we've talked about sort of what changes in the numbers are actually considered significant or important and what's
Right.
not. And so, for instance, just taking the top row on this one, 89, 90, and 91 is, if I understand, essentially the same number, because
Pretty
it's sort of
flat,
plus or
yes.
minus 3
Right.
is sort of the number. Whereas if you're looking down at, say, 75, under the Hispanic students, 75, 73, 81, that is a significant change. 73 to 81 is something that is there. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Yes, that's the conversation that we've had in the past, with respect to sort of looking at what is the variation that's meaningful. Mr. Reidinger, I have not actually ever seen, it's not on. I actually have not ever seen a regression analysis like you're suggesting, but I have a meeting with the state superintendent on Wednesday. I may ask, there may be some information out there that I'm just unaware of.
Okay, but do we have to do a regression analysis to know that poverty is probably the central impediment to academic performance? I mean, there are some things that we know already, right?
That is correct. I think when you look at the research that's out there, it would suggest that poverty is one of the leading drivers, certainly, or the leading driver for why students are not being successful. It would just, so yes to your question, it is about poverty. Is there other information that might be useful to look at? If you could rank order, for example, what are the most important factors that influence student outcomes or student achievement? We know poverty's one, maybe, I don't know, what might be two, but I would just look for it, that's all.
Right. And I think some of the conversations we've had at this level is we understand that to be a contributing factor, and that's not a variable we can change. But what we can change is how we respond, or how we better prepare, or how we look at future professional development and training. And so if that is a factor, and we're seeing that emerge in the data, then how does that guide and steer what we then need to do in our response? And does that mean that teachers who traditionally in this system may not have had students coming from poverty or living in poverty in their classrooms, does that cause them to need to respond differently? And if it does, are they equipped to do that? And is there some learning and training that needs to come with that? And so those are some of the things that we're talking about. Okay, so how do we compare to neighboring schools? Want to look at these?
Okay. All right. So I was talking to Mr. Bates, and, we were talking about how in the past we had compared ourselves to some local schools in the area, some of our neighbors, and we discussed, making sure the demographics were somewhat close, even though they are much larger in a lot of cases. But we also wanted to throw in some schools that also had IB programs as well, just to kind of like use that as another indicator. And when you're looking at these slides as we go through them, we're focusing on reading and math. And the percentage that you see underneath the name of each of the school, that is a reference to the economically disadvantaged rate at each of those schools, just so you can see a comparison. So for example, at Mason, we're at about a 9.8% economically disadvantaged, and Yorktown over in Arlington's at a 13.7%, so we're within a range. So when we're taking a look at this, we started where we just had Mason and the other schools, and we have the state over on the right, and just trying to see, are we falling in that same band? Like, are we, performing at that same level, even with our subgroups? The other thing we wanted to take a look at is whether or not we are growing. So if you look at Mason, you'll see that there's the 17-18 pass rate and then the 18-19 right next to it. So we're looking at a few different things here, right? So where are we at? So our color coding, a blue means we're showing some growth. So if we take a look at reading from Mason right now, we are showing some significant growth areas with our students with disabilities and Hispanic from one year to the next. consistent in some of the other areas, or too small, because the population's just too small in those areas. And then when we look across the band at the state, we're above that, and we're fairly consistent with where the other schools are, or neighboring schools. So let's take a look at math. So again, same kind of system. The yellow means that we are above the state. We actually did show some growth from the previous year in math. However, we decided we wanted to put a yellow on this because if you look at our neighbors, you'll see that all of our neighbors are in the 90s, and we're just kind of right there at that 88% pass. So that was just kind of a little area where we want to maybe take a look at. And when you jump down a little bit, you'll notice there's some blue, which is really great. We have to celebrate these. And you look at the growth areas, because we don't want to forget that you're looking at these subgroup populations, economic disadvantage from a 59 to an 83, a 48 to a 78 with our Ls, a 65 to a 92 with Black. I mean, these are things we really need to celebrate. Our teachers, we know, have been working hard, trying to differentiate for our students. We've had like cohorts with Jen Santiago for ESOL students. So they have been doing work, and we are seeing it move in the right direction. There are some areas, however, that we know that we still need to work on, and those areas are in the red. Red basically is showing that we are not even at the state pass rate in those areas. So those are definitely areas we need to focus on. And even when you compare us then to our neighbors, we are below where our neighbors are right now.
So when I look at this slide, and as we're kind of working through this, I think about, okay, so what are some things that are emerging that we need to celebrate? What are some things that we might need to pay attention to? And then what are those things specifically that we need to target, if that makes sense, with the blue, yellow, and red? So the blue, we're celebrating. The yellow, well, we might want to pay attention to that a little bit. And then the red, those are areas that we need to really think about targeting in the future.
Okay.
So I've got some doubts about how much mileage we can get out of these kinds of comparisons, but with that said, if you could go and visit and learn from one of these schools only, which one would it be?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so some of and again, just looking at this from, whether we want to say, a bird's eye view or just, an initial dive. So one of the questions, and I look at this with a lot of questioning and why might this be the case, or what is the data telling us, and why is it telling us? And so what I might do is I might look at, for instance, a Marshall, which we know is right down the road, and look at, are there things programmatically that are occurring with their special ed students without a 504? Are there some climate or cultural things? Are there some expectation things? Or are there some instructional delivery things, support systems in place? Are they doing things in a different manner to support students differently at that particular school that may have some of the some similar needs that our students in that category have? So that's where I would kind of frame my entry level learning from another school or another program.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I went right to Marshall. And mostly because they're so close to us, they're within walking distance, and also their economic disadvantage rate is much higher, but their scores are definitely doing well for their population. So I would want to visit them and talk to them.
That makes three of us, because
Yep.
clearly they're doing something, and if we're making these comparisons, let's ask ourselves, what can we learn from these
Right.
other schools, and let's try to learn from them.
Right.
Yeah.
NARIB. So.
Right. All right, so if we take now a look at Mary Ellen Henderson, And again, the comparison, the same way with the economic disadvantage rates. We tried, we